To have you back. Okay, we're live now. Hello, everyone. My name is Sandy Levesque. Welcome to the Think and Grow Rich Daily Hangouts. I'm joined today here by Glenn Walker in Nashville, Tennessee. Do you want to say hi, Glenn?
Hi there.
How are you? How is this morning going? It's quite early your side, isn't it?
I'm grateful for a new day to work with.
Yeah,
Right.
cool. Oh, yeah. And so today we're actually reading from the chapter on decision making, the mastery of procrastination. And so it's chapter 8, I think, but it doesn't really matter. But basically, yesterday we started from it, reading from it, and we read about how um, amongst all the people that Napoleon Hill interviewed, over 500 of them, he noticed that all of them were quick to make choices and decisions. They didn't spend ages doing, weighing up the pros and cons or getting loads of different people's advice. He advises to keep your own counsel and to have a mastermind that you listen to, but not to, sometimes people, when they can't make a decision, I've done this a lot in the past, you end up asking anyone and their cat, what their opinion is. And he's basically saying that that's actually a surefire way to, take too long to make decisions and therefore slow things down, and also to actually perhaps not make the best decisions you could make. So Glenn, would you be up for reading?
Sure.
Yay. Okay.
Just
Cool.
direct to the. I'm showing page 130, but what
That's right.
page are we really on here?
We were on the part freedom or death on a decision.
Oh, that's exactly where I was. Okay, great.
Excellent. Okay.
So I'll just start right there.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll mute myself.
Okay. The value of decisions depend. Oh, I've got a screen share first. Let me do that. And do that right there. Okay. Share. Okay. Is it showing? It's not showing up on yours, huh? Okay, let me try it again here. Okay, this right here.
Not yet. No.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh,
No,
I
it's
think
not.
it will now. There we go. That's it.
Is it there? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Can you
Great.
see it clearly there?
Maybe just a tiny bit bigger.
Bigger. Okay.
That's it. That's better.
Okay. The
Yeah. There we
value
go.
of decisions depends upon the courage required to render them. The great decisions which served as the foundation of civilization were reached by assuming great risks, which often meant the possibility of death. Lincoln's decision to issue his famous Proclamation of Emancipation, which gave freedom to the colored people of America, was rendered with full understanding that his act would turn thousands of friends and political supporters against him. He knew, too, that the carrying out of that proclamation would mean death to thousands of men on the battlefield. In the end, it cost Lincoln his life. That required courage. Socrates' decision to drink the cup of poison rather than compromise in his personal belief was a decision of courage. It turned time ahead 1,000 years and gave people then unborn the right to freedom of thought and of speech. The decision of General Robert E. Lee, when he came to the parting of the way with the Union and took up the cause of the South, was a decision of courage, for he well knew that it might cost him his own life, that it would surely cost the lives of others. But the greatest decision of all time, as far as any American citizen is concerned, was reached in Philadelphia July 4th, 1776, when 56 men signed their names to a document which they well knew would bring freedom to all Americans or leave every one of the 56 hanging from a gallows. You have heard of this famous document, but you may not have drawn from it the great lesson in personal achievement it so plainly taught. We all remember the date of this momentous decision, but few of us realize what courage that decision required. We remember our history as it was taught. We remember dates and the names of the men who fought. We remember Valley Forge and Yorktown. And we remember George Washington and Lord Cornwallis, but we know little of the real forces back of these names, dates, and places. We know still less of that intangible power which ensured us freedom long before Washington's armies reached Yorktown. We read the history of the Revolution and falsely imagined that George Washington was the father of our country, and that it was he who won our freedom, while the truth is Washington was only an accessory after the fact, because the victory for his armies had been ensured long before Lord Cornwallis surrendered. This is not intended to rob Washington of any of the glory he so richly merited. Its purpose, rather, is to give greater attention to the astounding power that was the real cause of his victory. It is nothing short of tragedy if the writers of history have missed entirely even the slightest reference to the irresistible power which gave birth and freedom to the nation destined to set up new standards of independence for all the peoples of the earth. I say it is a tragedy because it is the self-same power which must be used by every individual who surmounts the difficulties of life and forces life to pay the price asked. Let us briefly review the events which gave birth to this power. The story begins with an incident in Boston, March 5, 1770. British soldiers were patrolling the streets by their presence, openly threatening the citizens. The colonists resented armed men marching in their midst. They began to express their resentment openly, hurling stones as well as epithets at the marching soldiers until the commanding officer gave orders, "Fix bayonets, charge." The battle was on. It resulted in the death and injury of many. The incident aroused such resentment that the Provincial Assembly, made up of prominent colonists, called a meeting for the purpose of taking definite action. Two of the members of that assembly were John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Long live their names. They spoke up courageously and declared that a move must be made to eject all British soldiers from Boston. Remember this, a decision in the mind of two men might probably be called the beginning of the freedom which we of the United States now enjoy. Remember, too, that the decision of these two men called for faith and courage, because it was dangerous. Before the assembly adjourned, Samuel Adams was appointed to call on the governor of the province, Hutchinson, and demand the withdrawal of the British troops. The request was granted, the troops were removed from Boston, but the incident was not closed. It had caused a situation destined to change the entire trend of civilization. Strange, is it not, how the great changes such as the American Revolution and the World War often have their beginnings in circumstances which seem unimportant. It is interesting also to observe that these important changes usually begin in the form of a definite decision in the minds of a relatively small number of people. Few of us know the history of our country well enough to realize that John Hancock, Samuel Adams, and Richard Henry Lee of the province of Virginia were the real fathers of our country. Richard Henry Lee became an important factor in this story by reason of the fact that he and Samuel Adams communicated frequently by correspondence, sharing freely their fears and their hopes concerning the welfare of the people of their provinces. From this practice, Adams conceived the idea that a mutual exchange of letters between the 13 colonies might help to bring about the coordination of effort so badly needed in connection with the solution of their problem. 2 years after the clash with the soldiers in Boston, March 72, Adams presented this idea to the Assembly in the form of a motion that a correspondence committee be established among the colonies with definitely appointed correspondents in each colony for the purpose of friendly cooperation for the betterment of the colonies of British America. Mark well this incident. It was the beginning of the organization of the far-flung power designed to give freedom to you and me. The mastermind had already been organized, consisted of Adams, Lee, and Hancock. I tell you further that if two of you agree upon the earth concerning anything for which you ask, will come to you from my Father who is in heaven. The Committee of Correspondence was organized. Observe that this move provided the way for increasing the power of the mastermind by adding to it men from all the colonies. Take notice that this procedure constituted the first organized planning of this disgruntled colonists. In union there is strength. The citizens of the colonies had been waging disorganized warfare against the British soldiers through incidents similar to the Boston riot, but nothing of benefit had been accomplished. Their individual grievances had not been consolidated under one mastermind. No group of individuals had put their hearts, minds, souls, and bodies together in one definite decision to settle their difficulty, with the British once and for all under Adams, Hancock, and Lee until Adams, Hancock, and Lee got together. Meanwhile, the British were not idle. They too were doing some planning and masterminding on their own account. With the advantage of having back of them money and organized soldiery, the Crown appointed Gage to supplant Hutchinson as the governor of Massachusetts. One of the new governor's first acts was to send a messenger to call in Samuel Adams for the purpose of endeavoring to stop his opposition by fear. We can best understand the spirit of what happened by quoting a conversation between Colonel Fenton, the messenger sent by Gage, and Adams. Colonel Fenton: I have been authorized by Governor Gage to assure you, Mr. Adams, that the governor has been empowered to confer upon you such benefits as would be satisfactory. Endeavor to win Adams by promise of bribes, upon the condition that you engage to cease in your opposition to the measures of the government. It is the governor's advice to you, sir, not to incur the further displeasure of His Majesty. Your conduct has been such as makes you liable to penalties of an MT, I don't know what that means, of Henry VIII, by which persons can be sent to England for trial of treason or misprision of treason at the discretion of a governor or province. But by changing your political course, you will not only receive great personal advantages, but you will make your peace with the king. Samuel Adams had the choice of two decisions. He could cease his opposition and receive personal bribes, or he could continue and run the risk of being hanged. Clearly, the time had come when Adams was forced to reach instantly a decision which could have cost his life. The majority of men would have found it difficult to reach such a decision. The majority would have sent back an evasive reply, but not Adams. He insisted upon Colonel Fenton's word of honor that the colonel would deliver to the governor the exact answer as Adams would give it to him. Adams answered, "Then you may tell Governor Gage that I trust I have long since made my peace with the King of Kings. No personal consideration shall induce me to abandon the righteous cause of my country, and tell Governor Gage it is the advice of Samuel Adams to him, no longer to insult the feelings of an exasperated people." Comment as to the character of this man seems unnecessary. It must be obvious to all who read this astounding message that its sender possessed loyalty of the highest order. This is important. Racketeers and dishonest politicians have prostituted the honor for which such men as Adams died. When Governor Gage received Adams' caustic reply, he flew into a rage and issued a proclamation which read, "I do hereby in His Majesty's name offer and promise His most gracious pardon to all persons who shall forthwith lay down their arms and return to the duties of peaceable subjects, excepting only from the benefit of such pardon Samuel Adams and John Hancock, whose offenses are of too flagitious a nature to admit of any other consideration but that of condign punishment." As one might say in modern slang, Adams and Hancock were on the spot. The threat of the irate governor forced the two men to reach another decision, equally as dangerous. They hurriedly called a secret meeting of their staunchest followers. Here the mastermind began to take on momentum. After the meeting had been called to order, Adams locked the door, placed the key in his pocket, and informed all present that it was imperative that a Congress of the colonists be organized, and that no man should leave the room until the decision for such a Congress had been reached. Great excitement followed. Some weighed the possible consequences of radicalism, old man fear. Some expressed grave doubt as to the wisdom of so definite a decision in defiance of the Crown. Locked in that room were two men immune to fear, blind to the possibility of failure, Hancock and Adams. Through the influence of their minds, the others were induced to agree. Through the Correspondence Committee, arrangements should be made for a meeting of the First Continental Congress to be held in Philadelphia, September 5th, 1774. Remember this date. It's more important than July 4th, 1776. If there had been no decision to hold a Continental Congress, there could have been no signing of the Declaration of Independence. Before the first meeting of the new Congress, another leader in a different section of the country was deep in the throes of publishing a summary view of the rights of British America. He was Thomas Jefferson, of the province of Virginia, whose relationship to Lord Dunmore, representative of the Crown in Virginia, was as strained as that of Hancock and Adams with their governor. Shortly after his famous Summary of Rights was published, Jefferson was informed that he was subject to prosecution for high treason against His Majesty's government. Inspired by the threat, one of Jefferson's colleagues, Patrick Henry, boldly spoke his mind, concluding his remarks with a sentence which shall remain forever a classic: "If this be treason, then make the most of it." It was such men as these who, without power, without authority, without military strength, without money, sat in solemn consideration of the destiny of the colonies, beginning at the opening of the First Continental Congress, and continuing at intervals for 2 years until on June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee arose, addressed the chair to the startled assembly, made this motion: "Gentlemen, I make a motion that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and they be absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved." Lee's astounding motion was discussed fervently and at such length that he began to lose patience. Finally, after days of argument, he again took the floor and declared in a clear, firm voice, "Mr. President, we have discussed this issue for days. It is the only course for us to follow. Why then, sir, do we longer delay? Why still deliberate? Let this happy day give birth to an American republic. Let her arise not to devastate and to conquer, but to reestablish the reign of peace and of law. The eyes of Europe are fixed upon us. She demands of us a living example of freedom that may exhibit a contrast in the felicity of the citizen to the ever-increasing tyranny." Before his motion was finally voted upon, Lee was called back to Virginia because of serious family illness, but before leaving he placed his cause in the hands of his friend Thomas Jefferson, who promised to fight until favorable action was taken. Shortly thereafter, the President of the Congress, Hancock, appointed Jefferson as chairman of the committee to draw up a Declaration of Independence. Long and hard the committee labored on a document which would mean, when accepted by the Congress, that every man who signed it would be signing his own death warrant, should the colonies lose in the fight with Great Britain, which was sure to follow. The document was drawn, and on June 28, the original draft was read before the Congress. For several days it was discussed, altered, and made ready. On July 4, 1776, Thomas Jefferson stood before the Assembly and fearlessly read the most momentous decision ever placed on paper. When, in the course of human events, it is necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind required that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. When Jefferson finished, the document was voted upon, accepted, and signed by the 56 men, everyone staking his own life upon his decision to write his name. By that decision came into existence a nation destined to bring mankind forever the privilege of making decisions. By decisions made in a similar spirit of faith, and only by such decisions can men or women solve their personal problems and win for themselves high estates of material and spiritual wealth. Let us not forget this. Analyze the events which led to the Declaration of Independence and be convinced that this nation, which now holds a position of commanding respect and power among all nations of the world, was born of a decision created by a mastermind consisting of 56 men. Note well the fact that it was their decision which ensured the success of Washington's armies, because the spirit of that decision was in the heart of every soldier who fought with him, and served as a spiritual power which recognizes no such thing as failure. Note also, with great personal benefit, that the power which gave this nation its freedom is the self-same power that must be used for every individual who becomes self-determining. This power is made up of the principles described in this book. It will not be difficult to detect in the story of the Declaration of Independence at least 6 of these principles: desire, decision, faith, persistence, the mastermind, and organized planning. Throughout this philosophy...
Glenn, sorry to interrupt you. I think that's a good place to stop, because then I just checked through and it goes on for quite a bit more.
Okay.
So thank you so much. That was great.
Okay,
Good
great.
to hear you reading again. um, yeah. So and I find this a really fascinating story because I'd never heard of it before, and it's just amazing when you think that it really illustrates what he's talking about. You know, those two men, they had
Yeah.
a split second in which they could have just taken an easy option, saved their
Yeah,
own
they could have just
skin.
walked away, right? And
Yeah.
in
You
history, who knows what history would have become, right?
Exactly, because when you sometimes when we read things like 200 years later or 300 years later, it's kind of hard to like. I think that's where films are really good, movies, because they really put you in the situation. Because if you imagine right now, like you're up against the King of England at that time, one of the most powerful crowns in the world.
Yes.
You're fighting this tiring battle. They it probably would have been a lot easier for them on a personal comfort level just to say, okay, fine, we'll stop here and just go back home.
Yeah.
But they didn't doubt for a second, and they just put the cause ahead of what their own personal comfort would have said to do.
Yeah. So that was drawn with it from the power within them, right? As individuals, right? I mean,
Yeah,
imagine that. Imagine that power, you know?
exactly. And I bet that everyone watching, or watching this later on today, or whenever you see this, that you can remember a time when you had to make a similar choice, where you could have chosen something that maybe not, maybe it didn't. I don't mean similar as in, that the fate of the nation depended on what you chose.
It took
um,
personal courage,
but
right?
a moment of personal courage, when you chose something that, went against your own personal comfort and you put someone else or something else first. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes it's easy to forget those moments when we have had personal courage. So I just think, take a couple of seconds just to remember a moment where you did that. Can you think of one, Glenn, that you'd like to share? I can think of one that I could share otherwise.
Let's see, personal courage. Um, well, let's see.
Well, I can share while you're thinking. I can share something that
Okay.
came to me as I was listening. Um, and also just, I think if you're listening and you feel like you take a long time to make decisions, or you haven't had any moments where you feel like you made a choice like that, then it's never too late to start. And one of the best ways to start making quick choices, actually I learned this in a workshop, it was quite fun, is to practice. It's like an art. It's a lot of things that are in this book don't come naturally because we're kind of conditioned to do the opposite. And so I remember at a workshop I was at, they said to us, you've got 10 seconds left to live. What do you choose to do right now? And people could choose usually three things, but then after that, they couldn't choose anything else because they weren't used to making quick decisions or quick choices. And it was really fascinating, like how many times this proved to be true. People would just stop after three things. And so to kind of get into the habit of just choosing quickly, we were encouraged to, make decisions all day long. It's where instead of just kind of not deciding on stuff or asking someone else, like just saying, okay, let's do this. Or if someone asks you where do you want to go to eat, instead of saying, I don't mind, where do you want to go, being like, let's go to that sushi place, dunk. And you just practice with small things so that you start building up that muscle of what it feels like to just make a choice, even if you think that it might not be the right one. Because often also what stops people is they're worried that if they make a split second choice, it could be the wrong choice. And if you just sort of step outside of deciding whether it's right or wrong, and you just decide, well, I'm going to make a choice, it kind of frees you up from having to decide whether it was the right one or the wrong one. You just make a choice, and the more you do, the more you start to get an internal radar of what feels good and what doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
Like developing that trust we talked about yesterday.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, Sandy. We have our reasoning mind, right, which is the result of
Yeah.
education. Like I studied physics and you studied poverty and other things, right? You know, and our reasoning mind is very linear and leads you to come up with certain conclusions and things. But a lot of life doesn't necessarily come from our educated or linear thinking, right? A lot of it comes from
Totally.
intuition, right?
Yeah.
And that's I think what you're talking about, right? Sometimes the intuition will take you a certain way. And I was thinking about personal courage. Well, sometimes it's hard to love certain people, but I've stepped out of that and I said, well, I will love that person and I'll pray for that person or whatever because that person is a challenge, makes me grow by doing that. You know, so I think that's kind of one of my little illustrations of courage right there in that particular regard. You know.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, where it would be easier just to go, oh, I'm not going to see them anymore, or I'm not going to speak to them, but you chose something else. You chose to put that aside
Yeah, put
and
it
look at
aside.
the
You
great,
know,
yeah, look at what
maybe
the
grow
overall
as a result. You
yeah, yeah, exactly. So I'd be interested, if you guys are watching, comment in the Facebook group. I'm going to start asking more questions because I'd love to get more interaction from people that watch. Because I know there's a lot of us that are part of this group and that watch the videos because I see the stats. So feel free to comment after this hangout or after you watch it in the Facebook group in the in the thread where I'll post this video, an example where you had personal courage that you want to share, and I'll read it at least, and I know other people will as well. Because I think sometimes it's just nice to remember that people often can walk around with quite a low sense of self-worth in our society, and it doesn't have to be like that. uh, cool. Okay, so just to recap from today, basically it was just basically a long story about the forming of the American nation, and an example of where two people could have just and ahed and procrastinated and taken ages to make a decision, but they made a split-second decision which went against their own personal gain, and helped to create the American nation. So it's a really powerful example of the power of a decision. Because can you imagine if they'd said, "Can you give us some time to think about it?" Or
know.
can we have can we phone a friend, or like in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? It wouldn't have had the same impact, even if they did come back and say, "Look, we're not going to give in. We're standing our ground." It wouldn't have been as strong as the fact that they said instantly, "No way, Jose, I'm not budging." And it always reminds me this story of Nelson Mandela, and when he went to trial, and the trial that put him in prison for 27 years because of apartheid. It's really inspiring if you read the speeches that he and his colleagues said at that trial. And you can see it, and there's a film, The Long Walk to Freedom. They reenact it, and basically he was the last person to make a speech, and they were given the option to plead guilty and escape death sentence. They should have been hung, and there was a lot of pressure on them to do that because the government really made out that if they didn't plead guilty, they would die. And so they talked about this, Nelson Mandela and his colleagues, and that they just decided they were willing to die if that's what it was going to take, because they didn't want to plead guilty for things they didn't believe were wrong, because they were being made out to be terrorists, and they were arguing we're just defending our right to be humans, our civil rights as black people. To cut a long story short, Nelson Mandela was the last person to make a speech, and he actually said, "This is a cause from which I am willing to die if that is required." And it really moved a lot of people. And actually, as we all know, they didn't. The government kind of chickened out on its threats, and they didn't plead guilty, but they weren't sentenced to prison, to hanging. They were just sentenced to lifetime imprisonment. So, another powerful example. I think sometimes when you remember these examples from history, it kind of gives you some extra strength. Sometimes I have days when I feel really weird, or I just don't feel as good as I normally do, and I have a picture of Nelson Mandela in my room on a vision board that I have, and I literally look at that picture, and it just, I feel like something, I feel different afterwards, you know? It's like you just get inspired and feel more courageous. So, yeah, hope that helps everyone. Comment in the Facebook group with a moment when you've had personal courage and made a quick decision, even if it went against your own personal gain. And thank you so much for reading, Glenn. Any last thoughts you want to share before we finish up?
Nope. Just have a wonderful day.
Cool. You too, Glenn, and everyone watching. Have a great day, and remember, you can start practicing making decisions and choices with really small things and just build it up like a muscle.
Yeah.
So see you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.